It's lovely to be with you again. And yes, Roman and I seem to turn up on lots of the same sort of panels, and I guess that speaks to the fact that there's not that many people out there who are kind of, thinking long term and trying to take forward policy making in the interests of future generations, or perhaps at least those of you, and I can imagine that many of you on the Zoom call today are in that territory. I often describe people who are trying to shake up political systems to do that, or shake up public services or public policy to do that, as the frustrated champions. So the people who can see that there's a better way of doing things, but almost the system frustrates the good things happening. So short-term budget and political cycles, electoral cycles and so on. The intricacies of governance around, how we construct performance management frameworks, how we audit, all of that kind of, works against acting in the long term. So it's good to see some of the frustrated champions here, and it's good to see Roman as well. So over to Roman.
And I'd also just like to thank Sophie for that introduction, because indeed in my book, I describe her as one of the great time rebels of our age, committed to intergenerational justice and long-term thinking. And people like Sophie have inspired something that my partner and I did at the end of 2019. You should be able to see an image there of my children. Talking of children, I've got twins. And at the end of 2019, my wife and I decided to give them an unusual birthday present. We decided to give them our votes in the UK general election of that year. And so they were 11 years old at that time, and we all sat around the kitchen table, as you can see there, and we debated the party manifestos, and they then each told us where to put the X on the ballot sheet. And in case you're wondering, they didn't just copy our political opinions, they had their own opinions. But the reason we did this, of course, is because we live in a world that systematically ignores the interests of the generation upon generation of young people, future citizens who will inhabit the future world. And we know this matters more than ever, because never in human history have our actions had such potentially destructive consequences for future generations. We need to be thinking long term about the next pandemic that might be on the horizon. We need to think about the impacts of new technologies like artificial intelligence or bioweapons. We need to think about the long-term impacts of racism and wealth inequality that gets passed on from generation to generation, and certain kinds of public debt. And of course, we need to be thinking long-term about the impacts of the ecological crisis, climate change and biodiversity loss in particular. And all of this is, of course, because we live in the age of the tyranny of the now, where our politicians can't see beyond the next election, and well, most of them can't. Sophie can, but very few can, public officials too. Businesses can't see beyond the quarterly report, and nations are sitting around international conference tables bickering away while the planet burns and species disappear. And the way I think about this really is that I believe we've colonized the future. That we treat it like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological damage and technological risk as if there was nobody there. And, the very long distant future generations aren't here to do anything about it. They can't stage a sit-in like a civil rights activist or go on a salt march to defy their colonial oppressors like Mahatma Gandhi. They don't have any political rights or representation. They don't have any influence in our marketplaces, but it can be really hard to grasp the scale of this injustice. Now, many of you on the call will feel this injustice acutely already. Like so many young people I know in Britain who, were against Brexit and found that it was everybody who was over 65 who was voting for Brexit. This gets a lot of people really upset. But I think it's really important to try and show what it kind of looks like visually. And here's a picture of it. This is actually from my book, The Good Ancestor. And you can see in the corner there, the Dutch edition. I'm not going to say that in Dutch, de goede voorhoede. I don't know how to say it, but I can see probably you're all laughing in the background there. But anyway, it just came out this week. But one of the images in it is this, of the scale of unborn generations, that there are 7.7 billion people alive today. Over the last 50,000 years, an estimated 100 billion people have been born and died. But over the next next 50,000 years, nearly 7 trillion people will be born, assuming this century's birth rates level off and stabilize. And in the next couple of centuries alone, tens of billions of people will be born, amongst them all your grandchildren, if you have children and grandchildren, and their grandchildren, and all the friends and communities on whom they'll depend. So there's a real question there of, well, what legacy are we going to leave for those generations to come? How are they going to look back on us and what we did or didn't do when we had the chance? And someone who really thought about this issue a lot was the immunologist Jonas Salk, who was responsible for developing the first polio vaccine back in the 1950s. And Salk believed that if we were going to be, really take responsibility, we needed to ask a question, which is this one: are we being good ancestors? That's the question for our time, right? And he believed if we were going to be remembered well by those generations to come and be good ancestors, we needed to expand our time horizons. And instead of thinking on a scale of seconds, minutes, and hours, we need to think on the scale of decades, centuries, and millennia. Now, you might be thinking, well, human beings don't do this. I'm always looking at my phone, aren't I? But in fact, we're really good at long-term thinking when it comes to it. There's some really inspiring examples around. Think, for example, of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is collecting millions of seeds in an indestructible rock bunker in the Arctic Circle that's designed to last 1,000 years. They're collecting and preserving the world's plant biodiversity. That's in the scientific realm, but in the world of the arts and culture, there's the Future Library Project, a 100-year art project from the Scottish artist Katie Patterson, where every year for 100 years, a famous writer is donating a book which will remain completely unread and secret in the Future Library until the year 2114, when the 100 books will be printed on paper made from 1,000 trees that have been planted in a forest outside Oslo. Amongst the writers who've donated books are people like Margaret Atwood and Elif Shafak and others. And, Margaret Atwood in the top left there, she's never going to see the book she's donated published in her lifetime. She's never going to meet any of the readers. And it really raises a question, for all of us, which is, what kind of legacy gifts are we going to leave for the generations to come? And there's a question, though, of, well, how do we actually get better at this kind of long-term thinking? Can we really do it in our everyday lives? And I think that requires looking deep inside yourself, not into your soul, but into your brain, because actually it's here where our capacity for long-term thinking lies. We have a constant struggle going on in our brains between the drivers of short-termism and long-termism. Do I party tonight or save for my pension for tomorrow? Do I upgrade to the latest iPhone or plant a seed in the ground for posterity? And I think of these two parts as the brain of the brain as the marshmallow brain and the acorn brain. And the marshmallow brain is the bit which focuses on short-term rewards and instant gratification, the buy now button, all of that stuff. And it's named, of course, after the famous marshmallow test, where a marshmallow was placed in front of kids in an experiment in the 60s, and if they could resist eating it for 15 minutes, they were rewarded with a second marshmallow. But of course, the majority couldn't resist the snack, and they snatched it up and gobbled it up. But there are a lot of critiques of the marshmallow test, but that's only the part of the stories of who we are. The real critique, I think, actually, is that we've also got this acorn brain. This is the part of our brain that lives in the frontal lobe, particularly a part called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, in case you wanted to know. That's the bit which focuses on long-term thinking, planning, and strategizing. And we are really good at this. We've only developed this part of the brain over the last couple of million years. It's quite a new part of the brain. The marshmallow brain's about 80 million years old, but it's better developed in humans than most other creatures. Like a chimpanzee does plan ahead a little bit. They'll get a stick, take off the leaves, and turn it into a tool to poke into a termite hole. But they'll never make a dozen of these tools and set them aside for next week, right? But that's exactly what a human being will do. We are long-term planners extraordinaire. That's how we plan for our pensions or write song lists for our own funerals. That's how we built the Great Wall of China and voyaged into space. But it's quite an interesting thing to just try and think about, well, what role does the acorn brain play in your own life? And at this point, I'd love you to do something for me. I'd like you to open up the chat box if you would, and just write down in the chat the answers, your answers to the couple of questions you can see on the screen there. The first one is, what activities in your life are driven by your short-term marshmallow brain? And the second question is, what activities in your life are driven by your acorn brain? And so you just write down in the chat, like next to marshmallow, you might put, right, Twitter or chocolate, you know, those are the things, or sex, whatever you want to put in there, whatever drives you in the short term. And the acorn brain, it might be saving for a pension, it might be meditation. So just take a few seconds now, and I'd love to just see what you're writing down there. Let's see what comes up. Netflix. Yes, I'm addicted to that short term as well. One as well. Phones, smoking, short term, a very curious one because we know about its long term effects. Social media in general, gaming, coffee. Yes, I've addicted to that one. What about some acorn examples, people? This is all right. Acorn, right? Here we are. Jobs, meditation, yoga, healthy food, doing nothing. Oh, I love that one as an acorn brain activity. Very good. Reading, again, pension. You know, there's all sorts of examples there of ways we do engage, not just in short-term cycles, but in long-term, you know, cycles as well. And it really raises a question, which is, okay, you've got this marshmallow and acorn brain stuff going on, but how do we shift more of our activities towards the acorn brain, both in personal life and in public, political, and social life? And in my book, I describe, as you can see there, 6 different ways to think long term, which are matched by 6 different drivers of short-termism. And I call this the tug of war for time. Just like there's a tug of war in our brains, there's one going on in society as well. And I want to just talk about a few of the different drivers of long-term thinking that we can practice. Think of this as like a mental toolkit for switching on your acorn brain, for becoming a good ancestor. And the first one I'd just like to say something about is the idea of cathedral thinking, a concept you've probably heard of. You know, Greta Thunberg said we need cathedral thinking to deal with the climate crisis. It's all about embarking on projects with very long time horizons, sometimes stretching decades or centuries or longer. And it takes different forms. So in the top left there, you can see an example of it. That's Ulm Minster in southwest Germany. It was begun in 1377 when the citizens of Ulm wanted to build their own cathedral, but with their own finance it themselves. Well, they didn't finish it for more than 500 years until 1890. That's like the world's longest crowdfunding project. On the right, you can see the sewers of Victorian London, built after the famous Great Stink of 1858. That was when, you know, raw sewage was being, you know, shit was being thrown into the River Thames systematically. Tens of thousands of people were dying of cholera and diphtheria each year. But the smell was so bad in 1858, the long hot summer, that even members of parliament couldn't breathe inside the House of Commons, and they've passed the emergency legislation to build the sewers. And just like Sophie was saying that, you know, you shouldn't always be going for the cheapest option. You know, Sir Joseph Bazalgette, the engineer behind building the sewers, didn't go for the cheapest option. He used expensive Staffordshire blue bricks. He used new kind of cement called Portland cement that got harder when it contacted with water. And he built the sewers twice as big as they needed to be. That's why they are still in use today. That's long-term cathedral thinking, or sewer thinking, you might think of it. But I've also put another image there, which is a reminder that cathedral thinking also happens in social and political struggle. Civil rights movements, movements for women's rights, indigenous rights, take decades sometimes, half a century sometimes. So this is all about taking the long view. And I think these kinds of examples, I certainly find them really inspiring, a reminder of what we can do. We have the agency to think long in public policy and social and daily life. But cathedral thinking isn't always good for us, I have to admit. You know, in North Korea, the regime, they're interested in cathedral thinking, of passing on power and privilege from generation to generation, something probably Donald Trump was trying to make happen yesterday as well. And, you know, think about the corporate world too. A former head of the investment bank Goldman Sachs once said, we're greedy, but long-term greedy, not short-term greedy. Well, is that the kind of long thinking we want to encourage? Well, I think not. I think cathedral thinking needs to be joined with something else, which is another part of the cognitive toolkit of being a good ancestor, which is the idea of intergenerational justice. Now, the great comedian Groucho Marx once said, "Why should I care about future generations? What have they ever done for me?" And I think a lot of people intuitively feel that, right? Why should I care about people, even young people today, when I'm going to be long dead? I've got enough problems in my life today. I've lost my job because of COVID. I'm in debt, all sorts of things. I'm ill, whatever it happens to be. But I think that we all need to recognize that we have a stake in the future. Think back to that giant orange circle. Don't we have a moral responsibility to those billions of billions who will inhabit the future? And I think in thinking about intergenerational justice, we can draw on indigenous wisdom from around the world. For example, the Native American idea of seventh generation decision-making. So Chief Oren Lyons from the Iroquois Confederacies famously said, "We're looking ahead as one of our first mandates given us as chiefs to make sure that every decision we make relates to the welfare and well-being of the seventh generation to come. And that is the basis by which we'll make decisions in council. Will this be to the benefit of the seventh generation?" And of course, there are people in public policy, in politics, people like Sophie who have that kind of vision, but most of them don't. But can we even imagine bringing this kind of indigenous thinking, a kind of an ethic of ecological stewardship coming out of cultures like Iroquois culture or Dakota culture in North America? And can we make them work in the modern cities of today, in Rotterdam, in Miami, in Dubai, in Shanghai? Isn't this just wishful thinking, a kind of utopian idea? Well, I would say no, because there are real time rebel organizations out there who are trying to put seventh generation thinking into practice. In the US, for example, there's a legal movement called Our Children's Trust. And this is a public interest law firm that has filed a landmark legal case against the federal government and also state governments in the US on behalf of the 21 young people who you can see there, who are campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. Now, this is a serious David versus Goliath long-term struggle in the US. It's been going on for 5 years. It will take many years more because they're trying to establish constitutional rights for people, young people today and people who may not be born for decades. This is one of the most innovative and exciting shifts in thinking about human rights since the French Revolution. It is going on now as we speak. And Our Children's Trust have inspired really important legal cases around the world, in Colombia, in Uganda, and they've also influenced the famous case in the Netherlands, the Ogenda case, which has been about trying to establish rights in relation to carbon emissions and climate change. And of course, they're also, in fact, I'm just going to hold up a little book here. Any of you who are legal thinkers, if you can see this book here called Nature's Trust, Environmental Law for a New Ecological Age by Mary Christina Wood. This is what the book on which Our Children's Trust movement happens to be based on. So I really recommend that. It's about seeing the atmosphere and oceans as public trusts, which must be looked after. So Our Children's Trust is influenced by the Native American idea of seventh generation decision making. And so is this movement here called Future Design in Japan, directly inspired by the Iroquois thinking of seventh generation. And this is a citizen assembly movement where they invite local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. And they're typically split into two groups. Half of them are told they're residents from the present day. And the other half are given these almost ceremonial robes to wear. You can see in the image there, the orange robes like kimonos, and told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060. And it turns out that the residents from 2060 systematically support much more transformative and radical plans for their towns and cities, whether it's healthcare investment, climate change action, dealing with artificial intelligence or COVID-19. And future design is now sweeping across Japan. It's being used in big cities like Kyoto. It's being used in Japan's Ministry of Finance. I would love to see progressive towns and cities in the Netherlands taking this future design method. You know, there's a lot of citizens' assemblies already going on around in Belgium, in Ireland and other places. But why not add on to this idea of thinking about the future, wearing your robes? Why not get dressed up? Set up one of these future councils in your school or university or business or local town. This can be put into practice everywhere. And the great news is it works. These kinds of assembly organizations, particularly when you do that imagining to 2050, they take much longer views than your typical politicians who are caught in those short-term electoral cycles. Let me just say, though, that if we're going to think long-term, we can draw on things like cathedral thinking, we can draw on intergenerational justice, but we also need a guidepost. We need to think about, where the hell are we going? Why are we doing this long-term thinking? What are we actually aiming at? I mean, if you think about your own life, right? The famous existential psychotherapist Viktor Frankl, who was an Auschwitz survivor, he said, you know, we all need to have a meaningful life. We need what he called a concrete assignment or a transcendent goal, something bigger than us that we aim for in life, which gives us purpose and direction. And then the astronomer Carl Sagan came along in the 1970s and 80s and said exactly the same thing. But we need this kind of goal, not just for us in everyday individual life. We need it as a species. We need to ask ourselves, what is our big goal as a species, or what the ancient Greeks called a telos, an ultimate objective? Now, if we look around today, there are different kinds of telos or transcendent goals on offer. I mean, the main goal that we tend to be fed by our culture since the end of the Second World War particularly is the one you can see on the left there, which is the idea of perpetual progress, constant GDP growth. And as Sophie was saying, we need to be getting ourselves off this kind of obsession, this addiction to GDP growth, which has been taken by the left, the right, and the center. We know we can't keep growing and growing our economies while staying within planetary boundaries. We know we're using 1.6 planet Earths each year. And people like the psychologist Steven Pinker, you know, is an ideologue who thinks we can keep growing, growing, and growing. But even my kids know you can't do that. Even when they were 4 years old, they knew you can't keep blowing up the balloon bigger and bigger, thinking that it's never going to pop. Of course, it will pop at some point. So if you're going to be a long-term thinker, we've got to get off perpetual progress. Now, Elon Musk has told us there's another option as a goal for our species, techno-liberation. Let's just go to Mars. Well, it's not going to be very easy going to Mars. You know, even if we could terraform Mars and create an atmosphere on it, what's going to be the collateral damage for planet Earth, the one and only planet we know that sustains life? People like the British astronomer Martin Rees and others said that's the danger of thinking about wanting to people other worlds as our goal as a species, because there's only one place we know guaranteed that can sustain life, that we've been evolved for, and that is planet Earth. And I think of it a bit like mountain climbing, right? I shouldn't really use a mountain climbing metaphor with a mostly Dutch audience where there aren't a lot of mountains, but let's go for it anyway. You know, a great mountain climber, when they're going to go up a risky peak, the first thing they do is they make sure their base camp is in good order, right? You get your base camp in order before you go up the peak. In other words, we need to learn to live within the boundaries of planet Earth before we start going off to Mars. And that's why I think the great goal for our species should be one planet thriving, the third one there, meeting the needs of all current and future generations within the means of a planet. It sounds very simple, but it's very profound. You know, it comes out of the idea that, look, if you think about other species, how have they survived for 10,000 generations or more? Well, it's by taking care of the place that will take care of their offspring. In other words, by learning to live within the limits of the ecosystem in which they are embedded, by not fouling the nest, which is exactly what humans have been doing with devastating impacts over the last 50 or 100 years. So we need to learn to live within the boundaries. How do we do that? Well, we need new economic models. And I'm going to show you one of them that you'll probably be familiar to you in the Netherlands, which is the idea of the donut of social and planetary boundaries, developed by the British economist Kate Raworth. For those of you who don't know the donut, there's an inner circle. It's a donut, the kind with a hole in the middle, an inner circle which is all about social foundations. It's about meeting people's basic needs for food, health, water, and education. These all are derived from the Sustainable Development Goals, like Sophie's work is, of course, too. And on the outside, you've got an ecological ceiling made up of the 9 planetary boundaries developed by Earth system scientists like Johan Rockström, things like climate change, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss. And so what this is saying, the donut is saying, it's very profound. It's very different from the growth model. It's not about growing forever. It's about thriving in balance, getting into that safe and just space above the social foundation within the ecological ceiling. But of course, we know where we are today on a global level. That is our selfie for today. We are massively falling short on all the social foundations as a global society. The bigger the wedge, the bigger the shortfall, and we are massively overshooting on at least 4 of the boundaries, the ecological ceilings for which we have good data. And as many of you probably know, the donut model has been adopted by the city of Amsterdam as part of its long-term planning and decarbonizing. And then there's been some really important peer-to-peer inspiration. So when Amsterdam announced it was going to draw on the donut, then Copenhagen started doing it as well. And now countries like Costa Rica and progressive businesses are drawing on it too. So I think there's great hope in this kind of model. And I can also just tell you that recently, just a couple of weeks ago, Kate Raworth gave a briefing to Joe Biden's incoming Treasury team. She was invited to talk about the donut as a potential model for a kind of a 21st century US revival. Who knows whether they're going to adapt that or not. But let me just finish by showing you this, which is to recognize that the struggle we're all in is about human time horizons. We're living more and more of our lives on the level of seconds and minutes, that buy now button, 24/7 news. The challenge we face is to expand our time horizons to the level of decades, centuries, and millennia. It's about planting those acorns in the ground. It's about engaging in long-term social and ecological struggles. It's about building flood defenses that the Dutch are so good at historically since medieval times with the waterschappen and all of that kind of stuff. And we all have a lot to learn from the Dutch, from the Japanese, from Native American cultures. We can learn from each other in order to create the world that I think our future generations deserve. And with that, Morris, I would like to stop.